Growing your business will require you to apply more resources and more staff if you're going to keep up with the growth. Now, the challenge that a lot of business owners have is they're not ready to grow their staff and add more people. So, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about things that you should know in growing your team, and also stick around for the tax tea, because we're going to be talking about a person who was arrested for impersonating an IRS agent and a little bit of fraud. So stay tuned. So welcome back to the show. Today we're doing a different format. As you can see, it is Christmas time, or as you probably can see from the decorations, we are doing a different year-end thing. And one of the topics that comes up with a lot of business owners at the end of the year is really when it comes down to hiring and planning for the following year, because you may be thinking about bonuses for your current staff, but if you're thinking about growing, one of the things that you get into is like, okay, all right, how are we going to support that type of growth? So today we're going to be talking about that. Lola and I will be jumping into some of the things that we talk to our clients about as they're trying to navigate that growth. But first, how are you doing?
I'm good. It feels good to be home. So we're just coming after, celebrating Thanksgiving with our family. So that was really good. But now going through the process of like putting up all the decor and the Christmas stuff, which I will be honest, I can't take any credit for. Terrell does most of the work during Christmas decoration. So the tree is just a very, very snippet at what we're actually doing for the holiday. So we have like the village at the bottom. We're going full blown on the Christmas decor. Maybe we'll post some pictures, but yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this episode and for the holiday. So,
absolutely.
How you doing?
Absolutely. I'm doing well. I think it's just probably took a couple of days off from working on different stuff. There's a couple projects that I'm like, I guess you say, a little anxious to get back to finish up for some clients as they're trying to finish up some year-end stuff. We're working on some awesome new programs.
Yes.
Providing some CFO consulting to small business owners.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to someone at the National League for Economic Development. And we were just talking about like some of the national programs. And I was like, what we usually would charge like $2,500 to $5,000 a month, we're going to be doing for like $250 a month in the group setting. So I'm just like, figuring out a business model that makes sense for us and that also makes sense for helping more business owners to where they can get it for like literally like 90% discount.
Yeah. And I think just on that, like, I feel like pricing is something that a lot of business owners struggle with, because I think that's a conversation we had when we first started the company of, are we pricing at the right price point? And for us at the time when we first started, pricing was a big thing because you don't want to come in underpriced. You want to make sure that you're charging for the right services, the right price for the right services. And so I think this program is really good for us as a business, because the challenge we were facing, even when you would go speak at different events, was people were like, oh my gosh, I really love the information that you're putting out there. I really love what you're sharing. And then when we talk price, they're like, but dang, like my business is not where I can afford it, but I wish I could work with an accountant like you guys. So for me, I'm excited that we get to offer this, because I think it just helps us reach the people that have wanted to do business with us through the program, but also at the same time, it makes sure that we do it in a setting, because we're all about, like I said, like I always talk about accounting as the language of business. So the numbers have to make sense. And I think we found something where the numbers make sense and business owners can still get value out of it. So I'm really, really excited about this launching in January.
Yeah, and I think it's part of the growth journey for businesses, because I think as a small business, you're trying to figure out all these different factors and you're trying to grow your business. You may be setting higher targets or more aggressive targets, or however you're approaching it. But in that journey of growth, you're growing your revenue. You have to also grow your understanding of the financial side of your business, the marketing, the sales side, and even the operation side. And one of the areas that I think, that a lot of business owners kind of struggle with is, as you're growing your understanding in those areas, at a certain point, you have to actually bring other people in because there's just too much for you to do by yourself.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we're going to be talking about in more depth in the program is about, when it comes down to staffing, like what are some strategies around how do you make sure you can cover the cost for the growth and the staffing? And so, but today for the show, I did want to talk about some of that, some of the stuff we talk about in depth in the program, but actually just, give our audience that watches this show, that hasn't joined the program yet, is just give them some insight on that. So the first thing that we usually do with a company is a capacity study.
Yep.
So when it comes down to a capacity study, part of that is, I think it's the very simplest way to put it is you have to know how many people you need to hire before you just start just hiring people. Because I think the horrible tendency, and I've seen this done at, some of the world's biggest companies. Like we worked at companies that are $100 billion in revenue.
Yeah.
And they fall into the same exact trap is something needs to be done. They just like, all right, we need to put a requisition in and go hire somebody.
Yeah.
And it's just like, well, do you know how many people we need? Well, no, we just need to get this project done. So we just need to start hiring people.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of small businesses screw themselves up to where they go do that without doing a capacity study. They start hiring a bunch of people. Now the business isn't doing well financially because they didn't do the capacity study. They hired more people than they needed. And it's just like, hey, let's slow down. I know you need to get these projects done. I know you need more people, but let's do a capacity study first. What have you seen?
Yeah, I think I've seen that a lot. The whole just going to use bodies to fix the problem or trying to fix the problem with bodies. And I think the problem with that is then what happens after they do that is you have to let a bunch of people go because you either you kind of progress through the project and then you find, oh crap, like we didn't really need these people, or we needed a different kind of skill set. Because when people I think oftentimes, and I see this a lot with small business owners, is you're trying to fix the problem, right? Like if you think about even with restaurants, it's like, I'm just trying to bring people to serve. And a lot of times the question that I often ask is take a step back and understand, like, what exactly is the scope of work that you need, right? Like, what do you need this for? What are the kind of people that you need to hire? Because I think a lot of times there's that fear of like, man, like I'm going to miss out on the opportunity to be able to meet my customer's demand. But what ends up happening is you staff, and then when you staff and like it's not the right fit or it's not the right skill set, or you didn't even need this many people, you end up like either under delivering to the customer or not even meeting the full purpose of what you were trying to staff for in the first place. So for me, I think the first thing that I always say is understand is this a staffing issue or is this just a lack of a process? Because I think sometimes people try to fix problems by adding more bodies, and it might just be that you need to go fix a process. So that for me is something that I've seen, because I think once you do that, then you can ask yourself after you fix the process, okay, I think it just goes as part of the capacity study, because then at that point you understand, all right, I fixed the process. Okay, now I know this is actually the skill set that I need, and this is where I need it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point, because, if you don't really take the time to really understand, like, hey, what do we need to get done?
Mm-hmm.
How many people do we currently have? How much can they actually do already? Right. And I think once you start to lay that out to say, okay, all right, what do we need to get done? Our current team, what can they do? And then I think the next step is really looking at, okay, all right, what is the team doing? Because you may say like, hey, the team, this is what the client wants. This is what the team can do.
Yeah.
This is where they're currently performing. Yeah. And I think step one is, okay, how do we close the gap between what the team is currently doing and what they can do? And then we can see, all right, then you hire for that difference. Where I see a lot of people, what it is that the clients need this. Their team is performing here. Mm-hmm. And so they just go hire to fill this gap, which I'm just like, you're going to hire too many people. Yeah. Because part of it is that your current team is inefficient. Or even in some cases where it's like your current team could be better if you provided them with the right tools. Like maybe you need to, instead of manually invoicing all your clients, maybe you just need to pay $12 a month for a service that will automatically bill your clients every month.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought about that we've kind of had to do even in our own company is I think the helpful thing about the capacity plan and assessment is once you understand that, I think it also helps you know the skill set that you have in house, because it might not necessarily be hiring people to do that gap that you mentioned about, to fill the gap. It may be using the people you currently have in house to do what it is you need to do, and then going to hire more people to fill those responsibilities. So I'll give an example, like for us, one of the things that we had to realize, like as we were building the business, is from a capacity standpoint, I just didn't have the bandwidth to take on accounting and finance for our clients, right? And so we had to go hire someone and hire a team and build a team that could support accountants and senior and junior accountants. And then my move was to focus on the marketing of the business. And I think sometimes if you don't do that capacity study, let's just go, you would hire someone just to do the marketing, and then you're still trying to struggle. I would still be struggling to try to find time to do the accounting and finance. And it's like, no, you don't have the time and you don't have the capacity to be able to do that. So maybe we go hire someone that can actually cover the gap as the business is growing. And then you focus on taking care of another department. So for me, that was kind of tough, especially because like accounting and finance is my skill set. Like that's what I do for a living. But I think sometimes you need to be able to look at your team, not just your team skill set, but also the capacity that each person on the team has, and then make decisions, because it might not necessarily be you need to go hire a new person to fill the gap. It may be you use the person in the team and then go hire someone else to cover, what's not being done.
Yeah. I mean, and I think you also run into, sometimes you have these difficult you have to have these difficult conversations, because I was talking to a friend of mine, runs a law firm in Atlanta, and they have about 30 employees. And we were just talking about just kind of her journey and growth. And one of the things that her and I had an honest conversation about is like, when they were a really, really small team, like maybe 5 people, there were certain people who did, things on the team. And as they started to grow and they had to make some changes, like, hey, we no longer need you to be the only person who knows how to do this, and this. And the person on their team that they had that was there when they had 5 people, that person just didn't want to change. That person was like, well, I'm the only one that knows how to do this. And it's just like, well, that's not what we need anymore. Like, as we're growing, like we need to change. And I think that's part of the capacity assessment too. It's just like, is the gap between what the customers need, where your team is currently performing, is part of that, because you have some people on the team who don't want to adjust and don't want to change. Now, some of the times they don't know that they need to change. So you just need to have a very direct conversation with them to say, hey, I understand that you've done this for years and it has been very valuable, but here's where the business is now. And we need to make some adjustments. Now, if that person is willing to make the adjustments, great. It makes the difficult conversation less difficult, because then it's just like, hey, let's figure out what your new role looks like. But if the person doesn't want to make the adjustment, then it may be time to accept the reality that, hey, you know what? This may not be the right place for them. Like they may need to go find somewhere else that works, somewhere else to work that fits into what they are looking for. Because I believe that when you're hiring people, it's a two-way street. Or even when you have people on your team, it's a two-way street. It has to be mutually beneficial. Like as a small business owner, you can't afford to just hire extra people to fill gaps because there are people on your team that don't want to adjust to the new reality of where your business is. Like you may have to part ways with some people.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's actually interesting because I've been faced with those situations actually multiple times, where like just in working and being a leader, where there are people on my team that haven't necessarily they haven't performed as well, or they haven't been a good fit for kind of where the company is going or where the business itself is going. And I think just stepping back from the numbers for a moment and just thinking about the soft skills, a lot of times people don't want to do that because they're afraid, right? Like if you've been the same person that's been doing this, like I've been billing clients for 35 years. This has been my job at this company for 35 years. And now you're telling me you want to bring a system to do this. And like, so what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my job? What value am I going to bring? And I think a lot of times as a business owner in that moment, my recommendation would be, okay, if this person is stuck in their ways, because, you know, you kind of need to understand why. If they're stuck in their ways because, hey, like I've done this for so long, and if I stop doing this, am I going to continue to bring value to your company? or am I going to be laid off? Because that's oftentimes people's fear. Like they don't want somebody to take something over because then they feel like it takes value away from the value that they feel like they're bringing as an employee. And so that would be my advice, is just like being mindful of that, because sometimes it's not necessarily that they just don't want to change because like, man, they're just being belligerent. A lot of times it's just they don't want to feel like they no longer bring value. And I think is an important part of my advice is in that moment is just like understanding, okay, can we still use this employee in other areas, you know? And if you've offered the opportunity for them to do something different within the company and they don't change, or they don't want to take it on, like, then that's a different conversation. But I think a lot of times it's just that compassion to say, okay, fine, like you're probably a little bit nervous because you think like, all right, fine, if you're not a good fit for this, you're going to automatically get laid off. And it might not be that they're not a good fit. It may just be, hey, like they need to do something different. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like how I think that's, I guess, a soft skill of like, as much as we talk about like numbers, is just there's also different things in that area that they need to be considered.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's part of the reality of when you're running a business. Like, your customers are demanding that your business adjust and change. Like, the way we did business 20 years ago is very different from how we did. The way we did business 5 years ago is very different from how we do it now.
The way we did business before COVID.
Yeah,
it's very different.
So I think that, you know, and this is a challenge that a lot of small businesses have, which is why I say start with the capacity study, is because what a lot of small businesses run into is that, you know, well, these people have been around, you know, when we started, and it's like, that is great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to stay on the team forever, because as you're growing as a business, how you did business when you were, you know, making $10,000 a month is probably going to be very different from when you're making $25,000 a month, or when you're making 30, 40, 50, 60, and on up to when you're making, you know, 6 figures plus a month. Like how you approach your business, how you approach, you know, your customers, that is going to evolve. And if you don't have the right people on the team, then your business is going to stop growing. And that's one of the things that I would say is a negative for a lot of, you know, small businesses that I've seen, is they don't have someone, you know, that's having that difficult conversation like we're having now. Right. I mean, which is one of those things that I like working with small businesses, because, you know, we can introduce them to those conversations that they should be having. Like, you should be talking to your people about, you know, growth and what are they going to do as the business grows. Like, hey, here's what the business needs. Here's what their skill set is. Yeah. How do they still fit into the puzzle? And now, as a leader, you got to help them understand that. And then also as a leader, I think you have to assess, do they have gaps in their skill set? And is there something I can do about it? Or is it time to make that decision that, hey, we need to part ways? Because I think that as a business owner, when you're growing, like the capacity between what your team is capable of and what your customers need, closing that gap as fast as possible is critical, not only to growth, but I think to profitability. Yeah. And I think also in light of that, the next thing you got to do is figure out, once you do your capacity study, you realize like, hey, here's what the customer needs. Here's what my team can do at full capacity. We now have a gap. Then it's just like, okay, all right, how much can we actually afford to pay the new people to fill that gap? Because I think that is another part that people tend to miss, is that you got to have a plan on like, hey, don't just go out there and just start throwing out ads. Yeah. I mean, you need to figure out like, how much can you actually afford to pay somebody to do this role?
I think that's such a good point, because I think that's oftentimes where people get bit in the butt. And another area where I don't think people think about as well is when you bring new people on, especially if you're doing business in the US, pay is a big issue. So like if you bring somebody on and you're paying them more than what you were paying the person that got hired, like you need to be, that got hired 5 years ago, that got hired 4 years ago, like you need to be prepared for how that conversation is going to go. Because especially if you're a small company where like you have the person that, you know, you're bringing on, like maybe they're responsible for the payroll or whatever, or you're doing it all in house, like that person is susceptible, is probably going to find out like, oh, wow, like, okay, this person's making 10, 20 grand more than me. So that's another thing I don't think a lot of people think about. But as you're thinking about addressing your staffing problems, you also need to think like, how much can I afford, like you said, to pay this new person? But also, how is that going to affect the dynamic of the team? Because if I'm trying to be competitive, does that mean that, hey, I need to increase pay for some of the people I currently have? Or do I have a justification as to why I'm paying this person, i.e. more or less than I'm paying my current employees? Yeah. So I think that's also like an important thing to consider.
Because I think there's so many factors in that to where, like I said, you have someone who's been around, who's been loyal, and then you have someone new that comes in, they're making so much more. Right. And as much as we say that, hey, you put in the employment agreement that, hey, your compensation is confidential, it doesn't say confidential. I mean, it ends up coming out somehow.
Exactly, right.
I mean, even at some of the largest companies, it ends up coming out. And I think the thing that you also have to think about is, people tend to lie about how much money they make.
I didn't think people lied. Do people really lie about how
much money they make? People lie about how much money they make.
But because why? I mean, is it just more like lie in what sense? Like making more money, or say they make less money than
making more money? Like I will say, it's like, because I've seen it happen. Like, because I mean, working in finance for like major corporations, a lot of times when I'm doing the annual planning process, like I see what everybody makes, and then you'll hear like, these conversations and people saying like, hey, I'm at X amount. And it's like, I know the numbers. Like they weren't talking to me. They were talking to someone else. And I'm just like, they just increased their number by like 10% or whatever. And I think what it starts to do is it sets this bad expectation within the team. Because let's say, for example, if I'm talking to you and I'm like, hey, this is what my job is or whatever, and I inflate my number by 10%. And if you're applying to a job, you're going to ask for probably around the range that I said. And I'm just inflating the number. And then let's say if you get hired at that number, then the person comes back and you say, hey, thanks for the tip, I got hired at X. If I lied about my number, now I'm in my feelings like, how dare they hire you at X or whatever? And it's just like, and I do think that's a dynamic. I mean, that's a very important dynamic that I think business owners have to think about is not only can I afford to hire this new person, it's what other cost is going to come with this? Like, do I need to increase the salaries or the compensation of my existing staff? Also, does that come with the bonus? Like, do I factor that in? Also, the employer's portion of payroll taxes. How do I factor that in? I mean, that's going to be about, 7.5%, when it comes down to benefits and stuff like that. Like, how do I factor that in? Because what I think a lot of people tend to do is they say, oh, this person can be paid, let's say this role is going to be $55,000 a year. Like, that's not the only cost you're paid. Yeah. Like, you need to add another, at least 8% for the taxes. And then if you have benefits, let's add some more and stuff like that. And also, I mean, when you start thinking about the computer equipment, the software, like those types of tools, like
how long all those, to get them up to speed is another factor.
I mean, all of those things that and if, let's say, if the person needs special type of training for the job or certifications, like all this costs go into getting that person up to speed, to where I do think a lot of people don't think about those type of costs. They're just like, hey, we need to get this work done. And they're just trying to get the work done, and they're just focused on that. And it's just like, hey, we need to let's slow down to let's really look at the full picture of, by hiring this person, like, okay, customer needs this, the current team can do this. We are trying to close the gap, but maybe we need to look and see how much is it going to cost us to close that gap. And then there may be times where we can look at alternatives to say, hey, maybe hiring a full-time employee isn't the right way to solve that. Maybe we need to go hire contractors. I mean, that was one of the things that we looked at. Like, when early on, when we were making between 13 to like 17,000 in revenue, we were like, hey, it's getting too much for our current setup. We need to, we need to increase our capacity. Yeah. We could go hire a full-time person, or what we ended up.
The numbers weren't making sense. The numbers would not happen to hire a full-time person at that amount of revenue per year.
Yeah. I mean, and so what we ended up doing is we took a step back and we created a strategic partnership with another bookkeeping company that they just like to focus on bookkeeping. And we were like, that was the biggest gap in our capacity. So what we did is we created a partnership with them, and they had some extra excess capacity. So they dedicated one of their people on their team to support our clients. And instead of us paying like the full, hiring a full-time person, we just paid them a small percentage or a smaller percentage of each incremental client that we added. Yeah. So we didn't have to come up with all the money up front. It's just as we added a new client, they got, let's say 30%, we kept 70% or 35% or whatever the pricing arrangement ended up being. But what it did is it allowed us to increase our capacity. Plus, it limited the amount of cash we had to put out up front. Yeah. Plus, we were able to take advantage of that company already had processes and procedures in place. Yeah. So it's like, you know what? The time to get them up to speed, because they were already doing this type of work for other companies. Exactly. So it's like, I would say by the end of week 1, they were ready to hit the ground rolling with our clients that we were adding on. And I think that when you start thinking about how much you can afford, it forces you to have those type of conversations like, okay, all right, we can't afford to hire someone full time. So is there a different approach we can take?
That's a really good point. And I like what you said about just the partnership. I think partnerships are another alternative, whether you're basically finding a company where you can bring on people that you can partner with if you can't afford to hire full time. Because like for us, the advantage with that approach was if we brought on new clients, then we would pay 35, 40% of whatever the income we were getting was. But with hiring a full-time person, you're paying that person regardless of whether or not you're bringing revenue in or not. So that is something you need to consider if you have the buffer for it, which is why I think it is so important to look at your numbers and understand what your numbers are telling you. Because if you just go, like you said, throw bodies at it to try to hire or fix the problem, if we were just to go, okay, yeah, we're $17,000 a month, let's just go bring somebody in, like that would have been not a good idea at the time, because realistically, like our business didn't have that, because didn't have the ability to sustain that from a financial perspective. And so I think it's important to know that. But if we had not been close to the numbers, then we wouldn't have been able to make that decision. So, I mean, a capacity study, like we just spent probably 20 minutes talking about this, but I think it's so important because at the end of the day, you need to understand like the skill set. You need to understand like, what is it that you are even hiring for? Can you afford? Like all of these questions, I think are important questions to ask.
But I do think I look at it as two separate things. You have the capacity study, and then you have your financial assessment.
That's true.
Because where it's like your capacity study just tells us, what does a customer need? What can your team do? Now, you also have to look at where your team is currently, because typically there's a gap between your team's potential and where your team is currently performing. And I think internally, you can close that gap without incurring brand new costs. Some of that is usually just restructuring processes, procedures, making sure people know what they're doing. Because I think when you're a small business, early on, everybody's doing a little bit of everything.
That's true.
But as you're growing, you have to create a little bit more definition around this person does this. When this situation happens, here's the process that goes through. And I think as you start to clarify that, what you'll see is the gap between what your team is capable of, where your team is currently, that starts to close. And then as you close that, then you can say, okay, all right, what does the customer need? Where's the team now? And then we can hire, or we can use, if we can't afford to hire full-time, maybe we hire somebody part-time. Or maybe what we do is we hire a contractor, or we do a strategic partnership, or we start outsourcing some things, because then you can start looking and say, okay, all right, for my current team, if they didn't have to answer the phone all the time, they probably could do more of that stuff. So then it's just like, okay, all right, how much does it cost to hire a phone answering service? Because it may be cheaper to hire a phone answering service than it is to go hire a full-time person or full-time receptionist to do this. So I think that's where it really allows you, once you start looking at the capacity and the cost, it allows you to look and say, okay, all right, what are our options for solving this problem? Yeah. Because like I said, the unfortunate and probably bad approach that a lot of companies take is, well, we just need more people. And it's just like, well, you do need to realize if you hire somebody full time, like this isn't going to be cost that you can just turn on and off. Like if you hire somebody full time, and then it would be worse for your business if you then have to lay them off because you overhired.
I agree that is not a good look at all. You have to, because you overhired, or I think there's just so many reasons, or they're not the right fit. Like the capacity study helps you avoid putting yourself in positions like that. And then I think the second thing you talked about, the financial assessment, also make sure you can actually afford. You, like you said, like understanding the budget. How much can I actually afford to spend on this? We talked about like the pay gap, right? Like understanding, okay, well, if you have employees on your team that are making more money or less money, hey, are you prepared to adjust that? Have you factored in all the costs? So I think that financial assessment is equally important after you do your capacity study. What are some of the other things, like kind of as a next step after you do the capacity study, after you do the financial assessment, where we're like, all right, like the third thing that we think they need to do?
I mean, I think a third thing is then you have to set realistic expectations. Because especially now when it comes down to hiring, like you're not going to put an ad out and then somebody just show up. Like it may take some time, or you may have to work on how you're presenting the ad. Because I was talking to someone that said, hey, I just spent, $3,000 on doing ad postings on Indeed, and I still haven't found anybody good. And it's just like, hey, there may be an investment with you finding good people. So I do think that you have to think about that process. Now, I think probably a creative way of approaching that, I think, is, and we've done that ourselves, to where it's just like, hosting a podcast. Like one of our shows is Finance and Accounting Show, and we're interviewing other firm owners, to where I'm just like asking them in the interview, as part of the episode, as part of the podcast, I'm asking them a question like, hey, what are you guys doing about hiring? Like, how are you attracting talent? And what I noticed is some people are doing stuff before they actually need people. Like one of my newer friends, they run a firm out of Atlanta. They have about 50 plus accountants in their company. And one of the things that they started was the two managing partners. They started a podcast, and what they're doing is they're talking about the culture and how the leadership makes decisions within the company, because it becomes an attractive thing to where people want to know not only, hey, what's the compensation? They want to know what the culture is like. They want to know, is this a place where I can actually fit in? And what they said is, doing that, what it does is it helps build the culture in the company, and it becomes a good marketing and a good lead tool for like new potential employees. So it doesn't cost them as much money when it comes to put out ads, because people are already reaching out. And I think even for us, when it comes down to the shows and the content, like in the past 2 months, I've gotten 4 emails from other accountants like, hey, I love the work you're doing. Just want to let you know, if you're looking for an accountant to hire, just let me know. I would love to come work for the company.
We're almost there. We are almost there. We may be reaching out to those 4 people sooner than later. Listen,
to where I mean, I think is when you can get proactive about that strategy, because I think a lot of people wait until they need someone, and then they're just like, all right, we need to put an ad out, and then they don't get anyone back, and they're just like, I just can't find people. And it's like, it does take time to find good people. And then also, after you get people responding, it's just asking yourself, what is your hiring process? Like, because I think a lot of people don't really, because if you think about it, as a business owner, unless you're in your recruiter, we are not in the business of constantly hiring people. So it's not a skill that we practice on a regular. So we're not good at it.
Yeah. And honestly, if I take a step back and I just think about our experience in corporate, there are entire departments that are dedicated to onboarding employees. You have your compensation and benefits that just specializes in what you're going to pay, the market rate. You have a whole training crew that just makes sure, hey, employees have the right training. Then you have your manager's involvement. Then you just have HR that kind of makes sure people, you just fill out all the forms you need to fill, all the tax forms you need to fill out. You get the culture training, all of that stuff. There are, like, in bigger companies, there are people dedicated who that is their full-time job. So I think for me, it just stresses the importance as a business owner. You have to have this process down packed, because the 90 days, the first 90 days of this employee are going to make or break your company. And you don't want to spend all this money. And then you're like, oh, dang, like it didn't work out. Because usually 90 days, I can tell like the culture, I can tell, okay, you fed me some BS when you hired me. Like, this isn't what you said it was going to be. Or the job that you gave me isn't really what I thought. Or, hey, this is a toxic culture, whatever the reason is. And I think for me, it's so important for a business owner, my biggest advice is you need to make an impression. As much as you're saying that person needs to prove to you that, hey, they were a good hire, you also need to prove to them that was a good decision investing in them. And I think a key and important part of that is having a solid process so you're not scrambling and figuring it out. Like, I remember, I think when I did like as a manager years ago, when I hired like my first employee, it was such a mess because like, I just didn't know, like, when they joined, I was inundated with work. I had so much work and I was just like, all right, like, okay, here's the laptop. Just sit down there and figure it out. Luckily, this was somebody that was a bit more seasoned, but it's just like, you cannot operate like that. Like that is not the way to operate as a business owner. So I think this is something I would say you do pretty well. It's just like, I remember before we had our first employee start, like you spent weeks like, hey, this is the training. This is what they need to do. These are the recordings. This is where everything is. This is what their job responsibilities are going to be like. And then just invested time in like meeting with them on a daily basis when they started. Like, okay, hey, what are the questions you have? Hey, go through this. What are the questions you have? Because then I think it really, beyond just identifying what their job is, I think it also brings like that sense of inclusivity. Like they feel like they're part of the company when someone is like, all right, I'll help you. I'll walk you through this. I'll explain the culture of the company to you, how we do things here. And I think sometimes as a small business owner, it's hard for you to think like, all right, what is it that I have to explain to this person? And I think sometimes it's just like, well, it's just me and like 3 other employees, or it's just me and 20 other employees. But what you don't understand is like in that moment, it's like, if that person, if you have a, like let's say example, like a family feel, like it's important for that person to feel like they're part of the family. Yeah. And sometimes those conversations and stuff like that help create some structure, but also give the opportunity for then you to be able to focus on actually getting to know the employee and interacting with them. So you're not spending time once they start scrambling to be like, oh my gosh, like what is this person going to do? Right? Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that's very important because I think in the corporate world, like, Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies that we've worked at and even when I look at small businesses, people are horrible at onboard. They're horrible at hiring. And they're horrible at onboarding new employees to where it's almost just like only a very small percentage of people actually survive the horrible hiring process. I mean, it's almost like this hazing, pledging process that people go through. It's like, well, I got you started. We got you a laptop.
Yeah.
We don't have all the access that you need on your laptop. You need to go see this person, or it's like you need to figure it out. And I think the entire time, like within that first, let's say 30 to 90 days, that person is constantly feeling like I am not meeting expectations.
Yeah.
Their confidence is dropping. And part of that is because you didn't set that person up for success. And, that happened to me several times when, I was working in corporate to where I started a job and like, I remember once I started a job and my manager was in the UK. I was in the US and I had a phone conversation with my manager, but it was like really trial by fire trying to figure stuff out. And I think, to her credit, I don't think she had because it was a part of the business. Like the company I was working for had bought another business. So I don't think she knew the depth of some of the problems and the challenges there. Yeah. So it's like, I was like trying to figure out a lot of it, myself. And I think in the process of figuring that out, there's a lot of stuff that I learned. I'm like, once I start hiring people, I'm going to do the work. Like I said, when we hired our first senior accountant, I spent, about a month laying out like, hey, here's what I need. Here's what this person is going to do. Here's what they need to know in the first 30 days. Here's what they need to know in the next 60 days. Here's what they need to know in the next 90 days. And then I went back and said, hey, here's how many times a week I am going to meet with them personally. And here's what we're going to do when we go through those, those calls together. Yeah. And what I did is like, I knew that they were going to have to they were going to have to do like the financial reasonableness assessment on a lot of our clients. So I picked 4 of our clients and I'm like, okay, these 4 give us a variety of like the types of situations you're going to see. And so one call, I would sit down and I would literally go through the financial reasonableness assessment with them for that client. The next time we would do another client. And after they saw me do it for 4 times, I'm like, now you can take care of the other, 20 plus clients that you have to do because you've seen me do it. We've done it together 4 times.
Yeah.
And now you're ready to go do what you need to do. And I think a lot of times when it's time to hire people, we don't really think about that onboarding process. Like, what are they gonna be responsible for? And what types of experiences or what types of exposure do I need to help them get so they can be successful at doing that? Because what you don't want to have to do is fire somebody because they're not successful because you didn't set them up for success.
That's it. I think that's such a good point, because I think sometimes then you get frustrated. And if as a business owner, you're saying, man, like, I don't have time for this. Like, I have 15 other things I need to do. I promise you, you need to make the time for this, because if you don't and you just go bring someone in and you just hire them, they are going to be useless, not because of them and not because they're not a good person and they're not a good fit for the company, but because you didn't set them up for success. Yeah. And I think doing all that prep work ahead of time, it may take a while. It may take time. Like I said, I think you did such a great job at it when we hired our first senior accountant, and you started like a month before they started. And so I think for me, it's important to do that work ahead of time so that when you do bring that person on, you are prepared and you are in a position for success. And I think when people think about, solving their staffing problems, especially in this environment, it's so important that you don't just think about, okay, I just need to find somebody. Like we said in the beginning, you need to think about, hey, what is this person going to do? You need to think about, hey, how do I make sure that they have everything that they need to be successful at what I'm trying to bring them on to do for my company?
Yeah. I mean, and it created some other opportunities, because after doing that, there were other companies that reached out to me and like, hey, how did you get your people up to speed so fast? Like, hey, we'll pay you to do a training for our team because our people aren't good at onboarding people. And I think what it did, and I wasn't expecting that, but what it did is, as I was working with our first senior accountant and helping her get up to speed, is we also built out what the training manual looks like. Yeah. So now when I hire another senior accountant, like the videos are already recorded. I know the processes. And even at this point, I even told, the senior accountant we hired, like, hey, I'm just letting you know now, when we hire more people, like the stuff that, you're going to be doing the training, because like I've already taken you through it. And I think it allows me to do other things than leading the business. But I do think that, after you do your capacity study, after you realize how much can I afford to pay, then you need to think about, okay, once we get them on board, what does that process look like? Like, how do we get them up to speed? And I think the fourth and final thing that I'll say on this, I think, is you have to understand what's your ROI metric. And I think this is another part where, large businesses, small businesses are horrible at doing, is understanding the ROI. Now, one of the, I would say a simple way that I would say think about this is, when you hire this person, for this business to still make the same level of profitability, is how much incremental revenue do you need to bring on? So let's say, for example, if the company is currently making, let's say, $30,000 in profit a month after paying all the staff and the salaries and all the business expenses. If you hire this person, let's say you're hiring this person at, let's say they're going to cost the firm after taxes $10,000 a month. So now the firm is going to make $20,000 a month. So you need to go find customers that bring in an incremental amount of revenue to get the company back where it was. And I think that's one way to think about, like, how do we break even on this? Like, if I hire this person, how many more customers do I need to bring on board to make sure that we can cover that person's costs? And I think a lot of small business owners don't think about that, because they're just focused on, we need to do these tasks. Like, our current customers want us to do this. We're doing this. How do we close that gap? And it's just like, no, as you're closing that gap, you also need to think about how many additional customers do you need to bring on so that the business doesn't start going backwards when it comes down to profitability.
That's really, really good. And I think to add to that point is, how much revenue, like in that case where you gave, okay, your revenue goes, or your OI or your income or profit goes down to $20,000 because you're paying now 10 grand for a new employee. As you're thinking about what your revenue number should be, also think about the expenses that are going to be associated with that incremental revenue, or expenses, whether it's like for this new employee, if it's 10 grand a month plus benefits, hey, you know, are there new softwares you're going to have to go acquire for this? Are there new employee expenses outside of their pay that you're going to have to take on? Like all of those things you have to factor when you're trying to make the decision back to, okay, how much revenue do I really need to go get to cover this so that I'm either back to whatever your number was, which is at 30 grand in profit, or hey, I want to be able to grow because I want to be able to get more than that. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. And I think for the people that are, you know, for the business owners that are listening, I mean, I think, you know, if you're working with a good accountant, which I will say there are a lot of accountants out there who are not that great at this. There are accountants, I think, who are really great at, you know, helping you, provide you with the insight as your business grows. There are some accountants who are just great at, hey, helping you when your business is small, but they really can't help you when you grow. And there are some accountants who are just good at, you know, doing your tax return. And then there are some accountants who just suck. I mean, it's just the reality of it. There are some accountants that they're not good at helping you with any of it. They're just collecting their fees or whatever. And I think that if you're going to grow, it's time for you to really start looking at a more proactive accountant. And a proactive accountant would know, is saying like, hey, we need to do a fixed and variable cost analysis. We need to do a gross margin analysis so that they can tell you what those numbers are. To say like, hey, if you hire one more person, hey, here's how much incremental revenue you need to make sure that person's cost is covered. Now, if your accountant isn't able to provide that information to you, you're probably not working with a proactive entrepreneurial accountant. Because I do think at some point you need someone who understands the challenges of running a business and that can provide you with the information for running the business. Now, of course, that comes with the cost.
That part, I always like to caveat, do not think you can pay somebody $200 a month and get that quality of accounting. I'm just going to put it out there. You're not. Like we've seen a lot of accounting models where people are charging $200 a month. You're not going to get that. You're going to get the basic for $200 a month. So you got to level set expectations. I like that. It comes at a price.
I do. And I started telling people like, you know, if you want a very proactive accountant, you're looking at somewhere around like 3+ % of your so if you take what your monthly revenue is times 3%, that's about the range you're looking at. Now, of course, if you're a smaller business, it's going to be a higher percentage. But I mean, and to just give you an exact, you know, more direct, I mean, you're looking, that's probably starting at like $1,000 and up for them to do the accounting, plus to start looking at some proactive things like that. I mean, which, you know, for like some of our CFO clients that we do that for, I mean, they're paying anywhere from $2,500 and up because they're getting a bunch of other stuff too. But I do think that as a small business, if you're serious about growing, you do need to have some of that forward-looking assessment so you understand like, hey, if I want to bring on 2 new employees, okay, how many additional customers do I need to bring on? Because then that looks at, hey, well, what's your revenue to cover their costs? Then what's your average revenue per customer, doing the math and then backing into it to say, hey, to where there are our clients, to where if they're like, hey, we want to hire 2 new employees, based on knowing their numbers, I can come back and say, well, you need to bring on 8 new customers to cover that cost because I already know what their average revenue is per customer. I know what kind of products and services. And I think you really need that type of stuff. And I will say it does come with a cost, which is why, like I said, we're starting, you know, doing like, you know, the small, you know, the CFOs for small businesses, like that program that we started, which is we talk about different stuff. And even if you're not ready to pay that cost, like we walk through the math of here's how you calculate that.
Yeah, we give you the tools you need to go do it yourself until you can afford to pay somebody to do it. I mean, that's how I see the program is you get a really, really good deal because like we do consulting for some clients or some people who have their own accountant but need kind of additional support where they pay us, you know, depending on, we charge per hour for that stuff. Right. So you get to pay $250 a month. You get 2 CPAs on the call. You could ask the questions that you want. You have this conversation. So, I mean, I think definitely I would look at it as, hey, this is a good opportunity for you to help someone talk you through the numbers, or have someone talk you through the numbers. And when you can afford to pay somebody else as your business is growing, then you bring on an expert, a proactive entrepreneurial accountant. I like that. So,
and I think also, I mean, it's to the extent of, if you do already have a relationship with an accountant, one of the things I tell a lot of business owners is like, hey, go back and ask them. Like, say, hey, what would it take for us to do a gross margin analysis, a fixed and a variable cost analysis on my business? Like, ask them those questions, because they may know how to do it. It's just you've never asked and they've never volunteered.
Or they may be able to do it at an extra price. That's another thing. So, for us, we want to make sure we're doing what's in the best interest of business owners. So if you have an accountant that you're working with, and it's like, you have a good relationship, they're supporting you in other areas, it may just be going back to have the conversation and say, hey, these are the 5 things I want. Can we do these things? And if they're good at their job, they should be able to say, okay, hey, we can do it at the current price. Or, hey, this is how much it's going to cost for us to do all those other things that you want to do. So
absolutely. So I think, when it comes down to hiring, staffing, I mean, I think you have those. There's a capacity study. There's thinking about, how much is this going to cost? There is planning the onboarding and setting your people up for success. And then there's understanding your hiring ROI. Like, those 4 things are very important. If you do those well, what we have seen is businesses that do that well, they tend to continue growing and being more profitable. Now, to the new section that we talked about was the tax T. So in the intro, I talked about, for the tax T, there was a person who was impersonating an IRS agent. And of course, this did not end well for this person. So I'll let you share some of the details on that story.
Yeah. So basically, the story here is, let's just get straight. So the punishment for this person is up to 30 years in prison. It's basically the punishment. And okay, there's so many things wrong with this story. I'll start with the first thing that's wrong with the story. So this person is not originally from the United States, came into the United States, and then pretended to be an IRS official or IRS tax agent, filed over 1,700 tax returns. And I think like the return on these, so it doesn't share the details of exactly how this person was getting the money, but basically pretended to be an IRS employee, filed over 1,700 tax returns. I guess the money was somehow going into like this account that this person had access to. I think they said altogether they may have filed, I don't know, like upwards of like $2 million more or whatever in returns. I don't remember the exact amount. But basically in this case, it's like the worst thing you could pretend to be is an IRS agent. That's my perspective in this situation, because now the issue you're running into is you're impersonating an IRS tax agent, which I'm like, I don't even know how they did that. They filed this tax returns, and then now there's a risk of, basically for each, I think the way they're handling it is for each offense, they get up to 30 years in prison. So it's like 30 plus 30 plus 30, depending on what this is going to be if the person gets convicted. So yeah, no, that story, wild.
I mean, it is, and I would say that's an important one for business owners, because I do think within that story is the whole impersonating the IRS agent. Part of that is because you're calling people, you're asking them for their personal information, the information he used to create the false tax returns.
Yeah.
So where I think identity theft is very high when it comes down to, taxes and stuff like that, because I think that we've even gotten a call from someone that said, they were the IRS and that we owe back taxes and that we needed to pay. And they started asking these questions. Now, us being accountants knew that, okay, there's something about this ain't right.
And first of all, the IRS never calls you.
They don't. You can't even don't start with a call.
You can't even get an IRS person. You call an IRS call, you can't even get an IRS person on the call. Okay, it's a whole process.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they don't start with a phone call. So
so usually I will say for business owners and for individuals, IRS, usually their first communication is going to be a letter that they send you. And the good thing is on that letter, they tend to put a case number or some type of case information. So if they do call you, they'll reference the case number and that information. So you're not, deceived into handing your information over to a bad actor. And typically, they're not going to ask for a payment over the phone.
That part, that's another. Yeah,
that is another one I think that is very important. I mean, like I said, for this gentleman, came to America. I mean, I guess he saw an opportunity and impersonated an agent, collected people's information, and not only collected information and used that to file false tax returns. Now he has been caught for what he is doing. So which I think another important point is I tell people is that not everyone who's doing accounting or who inquires about your taxes or who prepares tax return is legit.
Yep.
So make sure that you are not working with shady people.
Yep.
And you can use some of your common sense to tell whether a person is shady or not. If a person is promising you a certain level of return without actually seeing your information, or if a person is asking you for personal information over the phone and they are the ones that called you, is likely that that's not a credible person that you should be sharing your information with. And I will say, and if you're unsure and a person asks you for your personal information on the phone, ask them for their number. Like, hey, can I give you a call back? And that way you look up their IRS agent or their company, you call them, and then you can tell by the way they answer the phone, if that's a legit business, or just ask, can I mail this in, or do you have an office that I can go to, or whatever. I would say avoid sharing your personal information, because then you give fuel to a gentleman like this, who is likely going to jail for a minimum of 30 years for his horrible impersonation of an IRS agent and fraudulent tax return. So thank you guys so much for joining us on another episode of Stuff Your Accountant Isn't Telling You.